Welcome to Her True Stories, the home of chilling revenge stories. Tonight, we're diving into a tale that will remind you why you should never underestimate a woman who's lived long enough to learn that kindness has its limits and wisdom comes with teeth. This is Margaret's story, and trust me, you won't see the ending coming. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. My name is Margaret Maggie Holloway, and at 67, I've learned that the most dangerous predators often come disguised as family. They smile at your dinner table, compliment your cooking, and call you Mom, while calculating exactly how much your life is worth to them. I was sitting in my favorite rocking chair on the wraparound porch of my colonial home in Stowe, Vermont, watching the autumn leaves dance in the crisp October air. The maple trees that line my property were putting on their annual show. Brilliant reds and golds that tourists drove hundreds of miles to see. I'd been blessed to wake up to this view for 43 years, ever since my late husband Henry and I bought this place as newlyweds. The house itself was something from a magazine: white clapboard siding, black shutters, and enough antique charm to make decorators weep with envy. Henry and I had spent decades collecting pieces that told our story. The grandfather clock from his mother's estate, the Persian rugs we'd bought on our anniversary trip to Istanbul, the mahogany dining set that had hosted Christmas dinner for our growing family for over 30 years. Every room held memories, but more importantly, every room held treasures. Not just monetary value, though some pieces were quite valuable, but the kind of irreplaceable items that represented a life well lived. Which is exactly why I was so disturbed by the way my new daughter-in-law had been eyeing them. Now Chelsea Holloway, much to my continuing amazement, had entered our family like a tornado in designer clothing. At 28, she was exactly half my son David's age, with platinum blonde hair that had clearly never met its natural color, surgically enhanced curves that defied both gravity and good taste, and the kind of smile that promised everything while meaning nothing. David, my beautiful, successful, utterly naive 46-year-old son, had met her at a conference in Miami 6 months ago. By month 3, she'd moved into his Boston penthouse. By month 5, he'd proposed. Last month, they'd married in what Chelsea insisted on calling an intimate ceremony, though intimate usually doesn't require 3 dress changes and a photographer who cost more than my first car. Mom, you're going to love Chelsea, David had said when he'd first brought her to meet me. She's different from anyone I've ever dated. Different was certainly one word for it. The women David usually brought home were accomplished professionals: doctors, lawyers, professors. Women with substance, intelligence, and enough self-respect not to giggle at their own jokes. Chelsea was decidedly not that type. But I kept my opinions to myself, mostly. A mother learns to bite her tongue when necessary, even when watching her child make spectacular mistakes. David was a grown man, a successful architect with his own firm, and if he wanted to marry a woman who clearly saw dollar signs every time she looked at him, that was his choice to make. The first red flag had been subtle. During their engagement party at my house, Chelsea had wandered away from the other guests to explore the rooms I'd designated as off-limits. I'd found her in Henry's old study, running her manicured fingers over his antique desk. "This is gorgeous," she'd said, not looking guilty in the slightest at being caught snooping. "Is it worth much?" "Worth much," I'd repeated, my voice carefully neutral. "Oh, you know what I mean. David says you have some really valuable antiques. I just love old things." The way she said "old things" while looking directly at me had not been lost in translation. Today's visit was Chelsea's third since the wedding, and each time, her behavior had become more brazen. She'd started arriving while David was at work, claiming she wanted to spend quality time with Mom and learn more about the family history. What she actually did was wander through my house like a real estate appraiser, asking pointed questions about the age, origin, and value of everything from my wedding china to the oil paintings in the hallway. The sound of her BMW pulling into my driveway interrupted my reminiscing. Through the window, I watched her emerge from the car like a performance artist, every movement calculated for maximum visual impact. Today she wore white jeans that looked like they'd been painted on, a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and boots with heels so high I wondered how she managed to walk without falling over. "Maggie," she called out as she climbed the porch steps, her voice honey-sweet with just enough volume to suggest she thought I might be going deaf. "You look absolutely radiant today." I smiled and accepted her air kisses, noting how her eyes immediately began their usual inventory of my surroundings. Today, however, her gaze lingered longer than usual on the antique secretary desk in the front hall, specifically on the small locked drawer that sat at eye level. "Come in, dear," I said, leading her into the living room. "I've made tea." "Oh, you're such a treasure," Chelsea gushed, settling herself on my vintage sofa with the kind of care that suggested she was mentally calculating its worth. "This house is just so incredible. Every time I'm here, I notice something new." She wasn't wrong. The living room alone contained Henry's collection of first edition books, my grandmother's silver tea service, and a Tiffany lamp that had been a wedding gift from Henry's parents. To Chelsea, it probably looked like a very tasteful treasure trove. "That's a beautiful desk in your hallway," she said, accepting the teacup I offered. "The craftsmanship is exquisite." "Is it very old?" "Late 1800s, I replied, settling into my armchair. "It was Henry's grandmother's. She brought it over from England when she immigrated." "How wonderful to have such family history. And that little drawer, it's so charming. What do you keep in there?" The question was asked with studied casualness, but I caught the sharp interest in her eyes. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was reconnaissance. "Oh, just family keepsakes," I said with a dismissive wave. "Nothing that would interest anyone else. Old letters, photographs, that sort of thing." "I bet it's all fascinating," Chelsea pressed. "David mentioned you have some amazing family heirlooms. It must be comforting to have so many treasures around you." There was that word again, treasures. Everything was a treasure to Chelsea, presumably because she was calculating how much each treasure might be worth if it were to find its way to an auction house. "I suppose," I said, sipping my tea and watching her over the rim of my cup. "Though I've always believed the most valuable things can't be bought or sold." Chelsea's smile faltered slightly, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "Oh, absolutely. But still, antiques can be so practical. I mean, if you ever needed money for medical expenses or home repairs, it's nice to know you have options." The audacity was breathtaking. She was essentially suggesting I should consider selling my belongings to fund my own old age, as if I were some pauper sitting on a pile of hidden wealth I was too foolish to utilize. "That's very thoughtful of you to be concerned about my finances," I said, my voice still pleasant but carrying just enough edge to let her know I wasn't as naive as she thought. Fortunately, Henry and I were quite good at planning for the future. "Of course. I didn't mean to suggest. I just worry about you, being here all alone in this big house. David worries too. We've talked about how vulnerable older people can be to, well, all sorts of problems." There it was, the not-so-subtle threat. The suggestion that I was vulnerable, helpless, unable to protect myself or my belongings. Chelsea was letting me know that she saw me as an easy target, ripe for exploitation. But what she didn't understand was that I'd been dealing with predators much longer than she'd been alive. I'd buried a husband, raised a son, built a successful career as a high school principal, and navigated 40 years of small-town politics. I hadn't survived all that by being naive or defenseless. "How kind of you both to be concerned," I said, standing to refill the teapot. "But I assure you, I'm quite capable of taking care of myself and my belongings. As I moved toward the kitchen, I caught Chelsea's reflection in the hall mirror. She was staring at that locked drawer again, her expression calculating and hungry. When I returned with fresh tea, she was back to her practice smile, but I'd seen what I needed to see. Chelsea wasn't just a gold digger. She was actively planning something. "Maggie, would you mind if I used your powder room?" she asked sweetly. "Of course, dear. You know where it is." But instead of heading to the guest bathroom, I watched through the kitchen doorway as she took a detour past the secretary desk. She stopped, glanced around to make sure I wasn't watching, and tried the handle of the locked drawer. When it didn't budge, she examined the lock closely, running her finger along the edge as if measuring it. When she emerged from the bathroom 5 minutes later, her cheeks were slightly flushed and her eyes bright with excitement. "That drawer in your hallway," she said, sitting back down as if nothing had happened. "It's locked, isn't it? You must keep something really special in there." "Just family keepsakes," I repeated, my hand unconsciously moving to touch the small brass key in my cardigan pocket. "Nothing that would interest anyone else." Chelsea's gaze followed the movement of my hand, and I saw her eyes widen slightly as she registered where I kept the key. "Oh, I wasn't looking," she said quickly, but her voice held a note of satisfaction that told me she'd learned exactly what she wanted to know. "I was just appreciating the craftsmanship." I smiled at her, the same warm, grandmotherly smile I'd perfected over decades of dealing with difficult students and lying teenagers. "Of course, dear. I'm sure you were." For the rest of her visit, Chelsea was distracted, checking her phone frequently and making excuses to leave earlier than usual. As I watched her BMW disappear down my tree-lined driveway, I allowed myself a small, cold smile. Chelsea thought she'd been clever, but she'd revealed her hand completely. She'd identified her target, that locked drawer, and she'd located the key. All that remained was for her to work up the courage to take what she thought I would miss. What Chelsea didn't know was that I'd been expecting this moment for weeks. I'd seen the hunger in her eyes, recognized the predatory calculation behind her sweet smiles. I'd been a high school principal for 30 years, and I could spot a thief from across a crowded hallway. More importantly, what Chelsea couldn't have known was that her new mother-in-law wasn't the helpless old woman she appeared to be. I was a woman who'd spent decades protecting what mattered to me, and I'd learned long ago that sometimes the best defense was a very carefully planned offense. As I locked the front door behind her and drew the curtains closed, I began to plan exactly how I was going to teach my son's greedy little wife the most important lesson of her short, misguided life. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The phone calls started the next week. Chelsea would ring me every morning around 10 o'clock, right after David left for work, with some transparent excuse about wanting to check on me or see if I needed anything from town. What she really wanted, I quickly realized, was to establish a pattern, to learn my daily routine, and identify the best opportunities for uninterrupted access to my house. "Maggie, I was just thinking about you." She'd coo into the phone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I'm in town running errands, and I picked up some of those blueberry scones you mentioned loving. Would you like me to drop them by?" The first few times, I accepted her visits with gracious surprise, playing the role of the lonely widow who was delighted by unexpected company. I watched her carefully during these impromptu social calls, noting how her eyes continued their systematic catalog of my belongings and how she always seemed to find excuses to wander through different rooms of the house. "Oh, Maggie, could I use your bathroom again?" became her standard refrain, giving her license to explore the hallway where the secretary desk sat. Each time, I would graciously direct her to the guest powder room, then quietly observe from the kitchen as she made her inevitable detour past that locked drawer. She was becoming bolder, more careless in her surveillance. I caught her testing the drawer handle again, running her fingers along the lock mechanism and even kneeling down to peer underneath the desk as if looking for a hidden spare key. When she emerged from these reconnaissance missions, her cheeks would be flushed with excitement and guilty knowledge. But it was during her fourth unannounced visit that Chelsea finally revealed the true scope of her intentions. "You know, Maggie," she said, settling herself on my sofa with the casual confidence of someone who already considered herself part owner of everything around her, "David and I have been talking about your situation here." "My situation?" I asked, pouring coffee from my grandmother's silver service, the same set Chelsea had been photographing with her phone the week before. "Well, you're all alone in this huge house with all these valuable things." She gestured vaguely at the room around us. "It just seems like such a responsibility. And potentially dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "Oh, you know, break-ins, theft, that sort of thing. Rural areas like this can be targets for criminals who assume elderly people keep cash and valuables at home." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Do you keep much cash around the house?" The question was asked with studied casualness, but I could see the predatory focus in her eyes. This wasn't concern for my safety. This was intelligence gathering. "Not really," I lied smoothly. "I do most of my banking electronically these days. Much safer that way." Chelsea's face fell slightly, but she pressed on. "But surely you have a safe? For important documents, jewelry, that sort of thing." "Why would you think that?" "Oh, I just assumed a house like this, with all these antiques, most people have some kind of secure storage." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I noticed that locked drawer in your hallway, and I thought maybe you had other security measures as well." There it was. The real reason for all these visits. Chelsea had convinced herself that my locked drawer was just the tip of the iceberg, that somewhere in this house was a safe containing cash, jewelry, or other easily portable valuables that she could steal without immediate detection. "You're very observant," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I just worry about you," she insisted. "Living alone with all these tempting items. Have you ever considered putting your most valuable pieces in a safety deposit box? Or maybe gifting some of them to family members while you're still alive to enjoy seeing them appreciated?" The audacity was stunning. She was literally suggesting I should give away my belongings, presumably to her and David, while I was still breathing. The barely concealed greed in her voice made my skin crawl. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said. "I'll have to think about it." "Of course. I didn't mean to pressure you. It's just that David mentioned you have some pieces that have been in the family for generations. It would be such a shame if anything happened to them." Another threat, barely disguised as concern. Chelsea was letting me know that she'd identified specific items she wanted, and she was growing impatient with the indirect approach. "What pieces did David mention specifically?" I asked. "Oh, well, he said you had some jewelry from his grandmother and some silver pieces and—" She paused, clearly realizing she'd revealed too much. "I hope I'm not being inappropriate. I just love hearing about family history." "Of course," I said smoothly. "David's grandmother did leave some lovely pieces. I keep them in a very secure place." Chelsea's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "That's so smart of you. Where do you keep things like that?" "A bank vault." "Oh, no. I prefer to have important things close by. You never know when you might want to wear a special piece or share a memory with someone. So, you keep them here?" "In the house." I smiled at her, enjoying the barely controlled excitement in her voice. "Some things are worth keeping close." For the rest of that visit, Chelsea was practically vibrating with anticipation. She kept finding excuses to walk through the hallway, past the secretary desk, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out where else I might be storing valuables. After she left, I sat in my kitchen and made a list of everything she'd asked about. Cash kept in the house. Jewelry from David's grandmother. silver pieces, location of important items, security measures, daily routines. Chelsea wasn't just planning a casual theft. She was conducting a systematic survey of potential targets, gathering intelligence for what appeared to be a significant robbery. The fact that she was married to my son didn't seem to factor into her moral calculations at all. That night, I called my old friend Martha, who'd been my teaching colleague for 20 years before retiring to Florida. "Martha, do you remember that student we had about 15 years ago? Jennifer Walsh? The one who was stealing from other students' lockers." "Oh, heavens yes," Martha replied. Sweet as pie to your face, but she had that look in her eyes. Like she was always calculating what she could get away with.
Exactly.
"I'm dealing with a similar situation now." "At your age? Maggie, what have you gotten yourself into?" I explained about Chelsea, her behavior, and my growing certainty that she was planning to rob me. Martha listened without interruption, her years of experience with difficult teenagers giving her the context to understand what I was describing. "So, what are you going to do?" she asked when I finished. "I'm going to give her exactly what she's looking for," I said quietly. "Maggie, not what you think, Martha. I'm going to give her the opportunity she wants. And then I'm going to make sure she regrets taking it for the rest of her life." Martha was quiet for a long moment. "You're not that sweet old teacher anymore, are you?" "I never was," I replied. "I just let people think I was when it served my purposes." The next morning, Chelsea called right on schedule. "Maggie, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I was wondering if I could come by this afternoon. I found some wonderful tea cakes at that little bakery downtown, and I thought you might enjoy them." "How thoughtful," I said. "I'd love the company." "Wonderful. I'll see you around too."
Perfect.
That would give me the morning to make some preparations. After hanging up, I walked to Henry's old study, a room Chelsea hadn't yet had the opportunity to explore thoroughly. In the corner, behind Henry's desk, sat the old safe he'd installed when we first moved to the house. It hadn't been opened in years, containing nothing more valuable than expired passports, old tax returns, and some documentation for investments that had long since matured. But to Chelsea's untrained eye, it would look exactly like what she was hoping to find. I spent the morning setting the stage for the performance of my life. By the time Chelsea arrived with her bakery box and her predatory smile, everything was ready. "Come in, dear," I said, leading her into the living room. "How lovely of you to think of me." "Oh, it's nothing," she said, but her eyes were already doing their usual reconnaissance sweep. "I just love spending time with you. You have so many interesting stories about the family." "Speaking of family," I said, settling into my chair, "I was looking through some old photo albums last night. I found some pictures of Henry's grandmother wearing the jewelry I mentioned. Would you like to see them?" Chelsea's face lit up with genuine excitement. "I would love that." I retrieved a photo album from the side table and opened it to a page featuring Henry's grandmother at various social events, dripping in diamonds and pearls that had been sold decades ago to pay for David's college education. But Chelsea didn't need to know that. She was quite elegant, Chelsea breathed, studying the photos with the intensity of a gemologist. "These pieces are incredible. They must be worth a fortune." "I suppose they might be," I said casually. "I've never had them appraised. They're more valuable to me as memories than as assets." "But surely you've had them secured? In a safe deposit box or something?"
Oh, no.
"I told you I like to keep important things close. Henry installed a lovely old safe in his study years ago. Everything precious is right here in the house where I can enjoy it." I watched Chelsea's reflection in the window as she absorbed this information. Her pupils dilated with excitement, and I could practically see her pulse quickening. She'd just learned that there was indeed a safe in the house, and that it contained jewelry worth a fortune. "That's so romantic," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Having your treasures close by. I bet you feel very secure knowing they're safely locked away." Absolutely, I agreed. Henry always said the best security was keeping quiet about what you have and making sure the right people know how to find it if something happens to you. The right people? Well, David, of course. He knows about the safe and how to access it. Just in case. Chelsea nodded enthusiastically, filing away this crucial piece of information. David knew about the safe. David could access it, which meant David probably knew the combination or had the key. You're so wise to plan ahead like that, she said. David is lucky to have such a thoughtful mother. For the rest of the visit, Chelsea was distracted and eager to leave. She kept checking her phone and making vague comments about errands she needed to run. I could see her mind working, planning, calculating the logistics of what she was contemplating. As I walked her to the door, I made sure to stop at the secretary desk in the hallway. "Oh, I should put this away," I said, pulling the brass key from my pocket and making a show of locking the drawer. Can't be too careful with family documents. Chelsea watched intently as I slipped the key back into my cardigan pocket. "Of course not," she agreed, her voice tight with excitement. After she left, I allowed myself a small smile of satisfaction. I'd given Chelsea exactly what she needed to convince herself that robbing me was not only possible but profitable. She now believed there was a safe in the house containing valuable jewelry, that David had access to it, and that the key to at least one secured location was kept in my pocket. What she didn't know was that she'd just volunteered to participate in the most expensive lesson of her life. Some educations can't be bought. They have to be earned through experience. And Chelsea was about to get the education she deserved. That evening, I sat in Henry's study and contemplated the safe that would soon become the centerpiece of my revenge. It was a beautiful piece, a vintage Mosseler with intricate scrollwork and a brass nameplate that read, H. Holloway, 1987. Henry had been so proud of it when he'd had it installed, calling it our family treasure chest, even though we'd only ever used it to store tax documents and insurance policies. Now, it was going to serve a much more interesting purpose. I opened the heavy door and surveyed the contents. Manila folders full of papers that hadn't been relevant for years, Henry's expired passport, some old savings bonds that had long since matured, and a small jewelry box containing my mother's wedding ring and a few other sentimental pieces of no particular value. It was perfect for my purposes, authentic but essentially worthless. I spent the next morning at 3 different locations, assembling the components of Chelsea's trap. My first stop was Henderson's Props and Costumes, a theatrical supply store 2 towns over that catered to community theater groups and film students. I discovered it years ago when helping with the high school drama productions, and I knew they had exactly what I needed. "Mrs. Holloway." Tommy Henderson greeted me warmly. He'd been one of my students 20 years ago, and we'd maintained a friendly relationship over the years. "What brings you to our little corner of make-believe?" "I'm helping my grandson with a school project," I lied smoothly. "He needs some realistic-looking play money for a presentation about banking and economics." The classics never go out of style," Tommy laughed, leading me to a display case filled with prop currency. "We've got everything from Depression-era bills to modern hundreds. How much does he need?" "A substantial amount," I said, examining the various options. "It needs to look convincing from a distance." "These are your best bet," he said, pointing to a stack of reproduction $100 bills. "They're obviously marked as props, but in dim lighting, they'd fool most people at first glance." I purchased $5,000 worth of fake bills, enough to create an impressive-looking stack that would trigger Chelsea's greed the moment she saw it. My second stop was Miller's Hardware, where I explained to old George Miller that I needed to repair a spring-loaded mechanism in an antique jewelry box. George had been fixing things in this town for 40 years, and he understood mechanical problems in ways that younger people simply couldn't match. "Sounds like the spring's lost its tension," he said, examining the small mechanism I'd removed from an old music box. "You need something with more snap to it."
Exactly.
And I needed to be strong enough to, well, to give someone a real surprise if they're not expecting it. George raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He'd lived in Vermont long enough to understand that sometimes people needed things for reasons they didn't care to explain. "I've got just the thing," he said, disappearing into his workshop and returning with a more robust spring assembly. "This one's got enough tension to give you a real jolt. You'll want to be careful installing it." "I'll be very careful," I assured him. My final stop was the most delicate. Dr. Patricia Wells had been our family physician for 30 years, and she'd helped me through Henry's final illness with compassion and understanding. She was also one of the few people in town who would have access to the materials I needed for the final component of my trap. "Maggie," she said warmly when I arrived at her office, "what can I do for you today?" "I'm embarrassed to ask," I began, "but I've been having trouble with mice in my attic. They've been getting into some storage boxes up there, and I'm worried about contamination. I know you deal with pest control issues in a medical context sometimes." Dr. Wells nodded thoughtfully. "Rodent-borne diseases can be serious, especially for someone your age. What kind of contamination are you concerned about?" "I've read that mouse droppings can carry some dangerous substances. I found some information about arsenic-based rodenticides being particularly hazardous if you handle them without protection." "That's absolutely true. Arsenic compounds can be absorbed through the skin, and even small amounts can cause serious illness." She paused, studying my face. "Maggie, have you been exposed to something like that?" "I don't think so, but I want to be prepared. If I did accidentally come into contact with arsenic dust, what would I expect to see?" Dr. Wells spent 20 minutes explaining the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, the initial flu-like symptoms, the progression to organ failure, the difficulty of diagnosis unless doctors knew what to look for. She also mentioned that arsenic compounds were still available for certain legitimate uses, though heavily regulated. "The key thing to remember," she concluded, "is that arsenic is cumulative. Even small exposures can build up over time and cause serious problems." "That's terrifying," I said with genuine concern. I had no idea such dangerous substances were still available. "They're not supposed to be, except for very specific applications. But you'd be surprised what people can still acquire if they know where to look and have a legitimate reason." I left Dr. Wells' office with a much clearer understanding of how to make Chelsea's theft as unpleasant as possible. A quick online search from the library computer gave me the contact information for a pest control supply company that sold arsenic-based compounds to licensed exterminators. One phone call later, I had arranged for a consultation about a persistent rodent problem in my antique storage area. The exterminator who arrived the next day was happy to sell me a small container of arsenic powder, along with detailed instructions about proper handling and disposal. "You'll want to be very careful with this stuff," he warned, handing me a pair of heavy gloves. "Even a little bit on your skin can make you sick. And whatever you do, don't let anyone handle anything that's been treated with it unless they know what they're dealing with." "I understand completely," I assured him. "Safety first." That evening, I assembled my masterpiece. In Henry's study, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, I carefully arranged the components of Chelsea's education. First, I dusted the fake $100 bills with a light coating of arsenic powder, using a soft brush to ensure even coverage. The powder was nearly invisible, giving the bills a slightly aged appearance that would only make them look more authentic. I stacked them neatly in the safe, creating an impressive pile that would immediately catch Chelsea's attention. Next, I installed George Miller's spring mechanism in a concealed compartment at the back of the safe, positioning it behind some fake gold bars I'd purchased from the same theatrical supply store. The spring was connected to a small but sharp blade, nothing fatal, but certainly enough to cause significant injury to anyone who reached into the compartment unexpectedly. Finally, for the piece de resistance, I prepared a collection of photographs that would add insult to injury. I gathered every embarrassing photo I could find of David from his childhood and adolescence. Pictures of him in footy pajamas, crying over a scraped knee, wearing a ridiculous Halloween costume at age 15. But the crown jewel was a collection of photos from his brief experimental phase in college, when he tried to grow a mustache and had briefly dated a girl who convinced him to pose for some truly regrettable artistic photographs. These photos went into a manila envelope labeled David's Private Collection, Do Not Open, and were placed prominently on the middle shelf of the safe, where they would be impossible to miss. The psychology was perfect. Chelsea would see the cash first and be driven by greed to grab it, coating her hands with arsenic in the process. If she was thorough in her theft, she'd reach for the gold bars and trigger the spring mechanism, injuring herself significantly. And if she was truly unfortunate, she'd also discover the photographs that would give her nightmarish insights into her husband's past. But the real beauty of the trap was its delayed effect. Chelsea might escape the safe with stolen money and embarrassing photographs, but the arsenic would continue working in her system for days or weeks, causing increasingly severe symptoms that would eventually require medical attention. And when doctors finally identified the cause of her illness, they'd find arsenic residue on the money she'd stolen, creating a perfect connection between her crime and her punishment. I spent several hours perfecting the arrangement, making sure everything looked natural and inviting. The cash needed to be prominently displayed, but not so obvious as to seem suspicious. The gold bars had to be positioned precisely to ensure the spring mechanism would activate when moved. The photographs needed to be visible enough to draw attention, but not so prominently featured as to overshadow the financial temptations. When I was satisfied with the setup, I locked the safe and tested the handle to make sure it opened smoothly. Everything was perfect. Now all I needed was to create the opportunity for Chelsea to discover it. The next morning, I called David at his office. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, using the tone I'd perfected over years of delivering difficult news to students' parents. "I hate to bother you at work, but I wanted to let you know I'll be out of town this weekend." "Out of town? That's unusual for you, Mom." My old college roommate Clara invited me to visit her in Burlington. We're going to see a show and do some shopping. Very spur of the moment, but you know how rarely I get away from the house. "That sounds wonderful," David said, and I could hear the genuine pleasure in his voice. He'd been worried about me being isolated since Henry's death, and he was always encouraging me to be more social. "When are you leaving?" "Tomorrow morning early. I'll be back Sunday evening. Do you need me to check on the house while you're gone?" "Oh, that's sweet of you to offer, but I'm sure everything will be fine. It's only 2 days." "Well, if you change your mind, Chelsea and I both have keys."
Perfect.
I'd known that David had given Chelsea a key to my house, ostensibly for emergencies, but really because Chelsea had insisted she needed access in case I had a medical crisis. What David didn't realize was that his new wife had been planning to use that key for a very different kind of emergency. "Of course," I said. "I'll call you when I get back." After hanging up, I made one final adjustment to my trap. I wrote a note on my personal stationery and left it on the kitchen table. "Gone to Burlington for the weekend. Back Sunday evening. The key to Dad's study is in the usual place if you need anything important. Love, Mom." The note was deliberately ambiguous. It could refer to a spare house key, or it could refer to the key to the safe in the study. Chelsea would interpret it however her guilty conscience dictated. Friday morning, I loaded a small suitcase into my car and drove to Burlington, where I checked into a modest hotel under my own name. I spent the day shopping and seeing a matinee performance of a play I'd wanted to see, creating a legitimate alibi for my absence. But I wasn't really gone. After checking in and establishing my presence at the hotel, I drove back to Stowe and parked my car in the garage of my closest neighbor, Eleanor Morrison, who was visiting her daughter in California for the month. Eleanor had asked me to keep an eye on her place, which gave me the perfect excuse to be in the area without arousing suspicion. From Eleanor's guest bedroom window, I had a clear view of my own house and driveway. I settled in with a thermos of coffee, a pair of binoculars, and the patient satisfaction of a hunter waiting for prey to walk into a carefully prepared trap. I didn't have to wait long. Saturday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, Chelsea's BMW pulled into my driveway. She sat in the car for several minutes, scanning the windows of my house and checking her phone. Even from a distance, I could see the nervous energy in her movements, the way she kept glancing around, the fidgeting with her purse, the deep breaths she was taking to steel herself for what she was about to do. Finally, she emerged from the car and walked to my front door with the careful casualness of someone trying to appear legitimate. She knocked twice, waited, then knocked again. When no answer came, she used her key to let herself in. From my vantage point across the street, I watched the lights come on in different rooms as Chelsea conducted her initial reconnaissance. She spent about 10 minutes in the living room and kitchen, probably looking for that note I'd left and confirming that I was truly absent. Then the lights came on in Henry's study. I imagined Chelsea's excitement as she discovered the safe, her pulse quickening as she realized she'd found exactly what she'd been hoping for. The next challenge would be figuring out how to open it. But I'd prepared for that too. Hidden under a stack of papers on Henry's desk was a slip of paper with our wedding date written on it, the combination to the safe. It would take Chelsea a few minutes to find it, but not so long that she'd give up in frustration. Sure enough, after about 20 minutes, I saw a flash of light from the study window. Chelsea had activated the flashlight on her phone, probably to examine the safe's combination lock more closely. Then everything went dark for a long time. I knew what was happening during that darkness. Chelsea had found the combination and opened the safe. She was standing there, staring at stacks of $100 bills that looked like more money than she'd ever seen in one place. Her heart was probably hammering with excitement and terror as she reached for her first handful of cash. The arsenic was already beginning its work. After about 45 minutes, the lights in the study went out, and I saw Chelsea's silhouette moving through other rooms of the house. She was probably searching for additional valuables now that she'd confirmed the safe contained exactly what she'd hoped for. But something was wrong. Even from my distant observation point, I could see that her movements were becoming erratic, less coordinated. She stumbled in the hallway, caught herself against the wall, and stood there for a long moment as if dizzy. The arsenic was working faster than I'd expected. 20 minutes later, Chelsea emerged from my house walking unsteadily toward her car. She was carrying a large purse that bulged with her stolen goods, but she was also clearly in distress. She fumbled with her car keys, dropped them, and had to lean against the BMW for support while she caught her breath. As she drove away, weaving slightly as she navigated the curves of my rural road, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Phase 1 of Chelsea's education was complete. As she drove away, weaving slightly as she navigated the curves of my rural road, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Phase 1 of Chelsea's education was complete. Now came the waiting. I returned to my hotel in Burlington that evening and spent Sunday enjoying a leisurely breakfast and visiting some antique shops, building a solid foundation for my alibi. I called David from the hotel lobby Sunday afternoon. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm just checking in before I head home."
Mom.
"How was your weekend? Did you have fun with Clara?" "It was lovely," I said, my voice warm with genuine contentment. "We saw the most wonderful play, and I found some beautiful pieces at the antique markets. I'll have to show them to you and Chelsea when you come by next week." "That sounds great." "Oh, and don't worry, we checked on the house yesterday. Everything looked fine." "Thank you, dear. That's very thoughtful." Actually, Chelsea wasn't feeling well yesterday evening. Some kind of stomach bug, I think. She's been pretty miserable today, too. "Oh, that's too bad," I said, working hard to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. Please give her my best wishes for a speedy recovery. I will. She's pretty worried it might be food poisoning. She's been having nausea, fever, some stomach cramping. How unpleasant. She should probably see a doctor if it doesn't improve soon. That's what I told her. Anyway, drive safely, and I'll talk to you soon. I hung up the phone with a smile. Chelsea's symptoms were progressing exactly as Dr. Wells had described they would. The arsenic was beginning its systematic assault on her body, starting with the digestive system and gradually spreading to other organs. But the real fun was just beginning. I returned home Sunday evening to find my house exactly as I'd left it, on the surface. But I knew Chelsea had been there, and the evidence of her visit was subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. The most obvious sign was in Henry's study. The papers on his desk had been moved slightly, and there were faint fingerprints on the safe's combination dial that hadn't been there when I left. Chelsea had found the safe, opened it, and helped herself to its contents. But she'd been more thorough than I'd expected. A careful inventory revealed that she'd also taken several small items from other rooms, a silver letter opener from the living room, a crystal paperweight from the dining room, and my mother's antique jewelry box from the bedroom, the one containing the few pieces of real jewelry I actually kept at home. The greed had overtaken her completely. What had probably started as a plan to take some cash from the safe had escalated into a full-scale looting of anything small and valuable enough to carry. Most telling of all, however, was what she'd left behind, the manila envelope containing David's embarrassing photographs. It was still in the safe, but it had clearly been opened. The photos were still there, but they'd been shuffled through and examined. I could only imagine Chelsea's reaction to discovering those particular treasures. Over the next week, I monitored Chelsea's condition through David, who called regularly to update me on his wife's mysterious illness. "She's getting worse, Mom," he said during our Wednesday conversation. "The doctor thinks it might be some kind of viral infection, but the symptoms are really unusual. She's having muscle cramps now, along with the nausea and fever." "How frightening," I murmured sympathetically. "Is she keeping fluids down?" "Barely. She's lost almost 10 pounds since it started. The weird thing is, she insists it's not contagious. She won't let me get too close, but she says she feels fine when she's away from the house." Interesting. Chelsea was apparently experiencing guilt-related psychosomatic symptoms in addition to the arsenic poisoning. Her subconscious was making the connection between her crime and her illness, even if she hadn't consciously realized what was happening to her. "Maybe she should see a specialist," I suggested. "Sometimes these mysterious illnesses require a more experienced eye." That's what I've been telling her, but she keeps insisting it's just a bug that will pass. She's being really stubborn about it. Of course she was. Chelsea couldn't risk having a doctor examine her too closely because she was terrified they might discover evidence of her theft. She was trapped between her worsening symptoms and her fear of exposure. "Well, please give her my best," I said. "And let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Thursday evening, I received an unexpected phone call. "Mrs. Holloway? This is Chelsea." Her voice was weak and raspy, nothing like the confident purr I'd grown accustomed to.
"Chelsea, there."
"David told me you've been unwell. How are you feeling?" "Not great," she admitted. "I was wondering. I know this sounds strange, but I've been having some really vivid dreams lately. Nightmares, really. About old houses and locked doors and family secrets." "Dreams can be so unsettling when you're ill," I said sympathetically. "The fever probably isn't helping." "Maybe. But these feel different. Like warnings, almost." She paused, and I could hear her labored breathing. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course, dear. Do you think, is it possible that someone could be deliberately making me sick?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with guilt and growing suspicion. Chelsea was starting to put the pieces together, realizing that her illness had begun immediately after her theft and was getting progressively worse despite medical treatment. "What a terrible thought," I said, my voice full of concern. "Why would you even consider such a thing?" "I don't know. I keep thinking about last weekend and how I felt fine before then and now." She trailed off, clearly reluctant to reveal too much. "What about last weekend?" "Nothing specific. I just wondered if maybe I was exposed to something that wasn't meant for me." There it was, the dawning realization that her theft had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Chelsea was beginning to understand that she'd walked into a trap, but she still didn't fully comprehend the scope of what she'd done to herself. "Chelsea, are you suggesting that someone deliberately poisoned you?" "I don't know what I'm suggesting," she said miserably. "I just know that I've never felt this sick in my life, and nothing the doctors are giving me is helping." "Have you told them about your suspicions?" "I can't. I mean, what would I say? That I think my husband's mother tried to poison me? They'd think I was crazy. Well, they might want to run some tests. Rule out any environmental toxins or chemical exposures." "Maybe." But her voice suggested she had no intention of pursuing that avenue. Chelsea knew that additional testing might reveal what she'd been exposed to, which would inevitably lead to questions about how and where the exposure had occurred. "I'm so sorry you're going through this," I said with genuine sounding sympathy. "Is there anything I can do to help? I could bring you some soup, or—"
No.
The response was sharp, almost panicked. "I mean, thank you, but I don't want to risk getting you sick too." "Of course. You're being very thoughtful." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen and smiled with satisfaction. Chelsea was trapped in a prison of her own making. She was getting sicker by the day, but she couldn't seek proper medical treatment because she was terrified of what the doctors might discover. She suspected she'd been deliberately poisoned, but she couldn't report it without revealing her own crimes. Most deliciously of all, she was starting to suspect me, but she had no proof, no way to confront me without admitting what she'd done. It was perfect. Friday afternoon, David called with an update that was even better than I'd hoped. "Mom, I'm really worried about Chelsea. She's become completely paranoid. She's convinced that someone is trying to hurt her, but she won't tell me who or why." "That's very concerning," I said. "Paranoia can be a symptom of serious illness. Has she agreed to see a specialist yet?"
Finally, yes.
"I'm taking her to the emergency room this afternoon. She's been having chest pains and difficulty breathing, and her fever spiked to 103 this morning." "Oh my, that does sound serious." "The weird thing is, she keeps talking about family secrets and things that shouldn't be touched. She made me promise to change all the locks on our apartment, and she's been checking the windows and doors obsessively." Chelsea's guilty conscience was eating her alive. The stress of her crime, combined with the physical effects of the arsenic poisoning, was pushing her toward a complete psychological breakdown. "I hope the doctors can figure out what's wrong," I said. "So, do I." "Oh, and Mom? She's been asking about you a lot. Wanting to know about your background, your hobbies, whether you've ever studied chemistry or medicine. Really strange questions." "I can't imagine why she'd be curious about that." "Neither can I. But she seems convinced that you're somehow connected to her illness." "That's ridiculous," I said, adding just enough indignation to my voice to sound convincing. "I've been nothing but kind to that girl." "I know, Mom. I told her she was being crazy. The fever must be affecting her thinking." "I hope she gets better soon," I said. "Please keep me posted on what the doctors say." "I will. Love you, Mom." "Love you too, sweetheart." After David hung up, I allowed myself a moment of pure triumph. Chelsea was heading to the hospital, where blood tests would eventually reveal the arsenic in her system. But by then, It would be too late to prevent permanent damage to her organs, and she'd still have no way to explain how she'd been exposed without confessing to her crimes. The trap was closing exactly as I'd planned. That evening, I received another call from David. "Mom, you're not going to believe this. The doctors found arsenic in Chelsea's blood." "Arsenic?" I gasped, putting genuine shock into my voice. "How is that possible?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. The levels are really high enough to cause serious organ damage if it's not treated immediately. They've started her on chelation therapy, but the doctors are saying there could be permanent effects." "That's horrible. Do they have any idea how she was exposed?"
"None."
"They've asked about her work environment, what she's been eating, whether we've been doing any home renovations." Nothing makes sense. "What about the police?" "Surely they'll want to investigate. They're sending someone to talk to her tomorrow, but Chelsea is, well, she's not being very cooperative. She keeps insisting she doesn't want to make a big deal out of it." Of course she didn't. Chelsea knew exactly how she'd been exposed to arsenic, but she couldn't tell the police without admitting to theft. She was trapped between the need for justice and the fear of self-incrimination. "That seems odd," I said carefully. "If someone poisoned her, wouldn't she want them caught?" "You'd think so. But she's been saying some really strange things about deserving what happened and learning her lesson. The doctors think the arsenic might be affecting her brain."
Perfect.
Chelsea's guilt was so overwhelming that she was essentially confessing to wrongdoing, even if she couldn't be specific about what she'd done. "I should probably come to the hospital," I said. "She's family now, and family supports each other during difficult times." "That's really sweet of you, Mom, but I don't think Chelsea wants visitors right now. She's been pretty agitated whenever anyone mentions bringing people to see her." "I understand. Just let her know I'm thinking of her." After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of Henry's best bourbon and toasted my late husband's photograph. "She walked right into it, darling," I said to his smiling face. "Just like you always said people would if they got too greedy for their own good." Chelsea was now hospitalized with arsenic poisoning, facing the possibility of permanent organ damage, liver failure, and neurological problems. The stolen cash was still in her possession, but it was evidence of her crime that she couldn't dispose of without making her situation worse. And the best part? She knew I was responsible, but she could never prove it without admitting she'd stolen from me. The lesson was being learned, whether Chelsea wanted to learn it or not. The hospital room was a study in antiseptic desperation when I finally visited Chelsea 4 days after her admission. David had called that morning to say she was asking for me specifically, a request that surprised him but delighted me. "She says she needs to talk to you about something important," he'd explained. "The doctors think it might help her psychologically to clear the air about whatever's been bothering her." Of course it would help. Chelsea was drowning in guilt, and she thought confessing to me might somehow alleviate her suffering. What she didn't understand was that I had no intention of offering her absolution. I arrived at the hospital carrying a bouquet of white daisies, Henry's favorite flowers, and wearing my most convincing expression of concerned motherly love. The nurses at the desk directed me to room 347, warning me that Mrs. Holloway was having a difficult time and might not be entirely coherent. Chelsea looked like death, wearing a hospital gown. The vibrant, predatory woman who'd invaded my home just weeks ago had been replaced by a hollow-eyed wraith with gray skin and trembling hands. Her platinum blonde hair hung limp and unwashed, and her surgically enhanced lips were cracked and colorless. But her eyes held the desperate clarity of someone who knew exactly what was happening to her and why. "Maggie," she whispered when I entered the room. Her voice was barely audible, ravaged by the medications and the progression of the poisoning. "Hello, dear," I said, settling into the visitor's chair with the gentle movements of a caring family member. "How are you feeling?" "You know how I'm feeling." The words were soft but loaded with accusation. You know exactly what's wrong with me. I tilted my head with practiced confusion. I'm afraid I don't understand. Chelsea struggled to sit up higher in her bed, wincing with the effort.
Please.
Don't pretend anymore. I know what I did, and I know what you did to me because of it. Chelsea, sweetheart, you're not making sense. The doctors said the arsenic might be affecting your thinking. The arsenic you put on the money, she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with desperation. The money in your safe. The money I took. There it was, the confession I'd been waiting for. Chelsea had just admitted to stealing from me, and she'd connected her theft to her poisoning. But admitting it to me wasn't the same as being able to prove it or report it to authorities. I don't know what you're talking about, I said gently. What money? Chelsea's eyes filled with tears of frustration. You know what money? The cash from your husband's safe. The hundreds of bills you dusted with poison and left there like bait. Chelsea, dear, I think you're confused. Henry's safe contains some old documents and a few pieces of sentimental jewelry. There's no cash in there. Yes, there is. Her voice rose, causing a monitor to beep faster. I saw it. I took it. It's in my apartment right now, hidden in my closet. You took money from my safe? I let my voice carry surprise and hurt. Chelsea, why would you do such a thing? The question broke her completely. Chelsea began sobbing with the kind of raw anguish that comes from recognizing your own fundamental corruption. I don't know, she wept. I thought you had so much, and you're old, and I thought you wouldn't miss it. I thought David would inherit it all anyway, so what was the difference if I took some now? But I trusted you, I said, my voice heavy with disappointment. You're my son's wife. Your family. I know, and I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry, Maggie.
I never meant for it to go this far. I just saw all those beautiful things in your house, and I started thinking about how much they were worth, and you decided to steal from me. Yes. The word was barely a whisper. And now I'm dying because of it. I reached over and took her trembling hand in mine, noting how the skin felt papery and cold. Chelsea, you're not dying. The doctors are taking good care of you. The doctors don't know what you know, she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. They don't know that this isn't random. This is punishment. For what? For being greedy. For being selfish. For thinking I could take what belonged to someone else without consequences. I squeezed her hand gently. Chelsea, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you telling me that you broke into my home and stole money from my safe? She nodded miserably. And you believe that I somehow poisoned this money in advance, knowing you would steal it? Another nod. That would mean I deliberately set a trap for you. That I planned to poison my own daughter-in-law. Yes, she whispered. And it worked. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the autumn landscape while I chose my words carefully. When I turned back to Chelsea, my expression was serene and slightly sad. Chelsea, I need you to think about what you're suggesting. You're saying that I, a 67-year-old retired school principal, somehow acquired arsenic, anticipated that you would rob me, and deliberately contaminated money in my safe to poison you when you stole it. I know how it sounds. It sounds like the paranoid delusions of someone whose brain has been damaged by poisoning, I said gently, which is exactly what the doctors said we should expect. Chelsea stared at me in horror as the implications sank in. Even if she was right about everything, and we both knew she was, her accusations would be dismissed as the ravings of a brain-damaged theft victim. You planned this, she said, her voice hollow with realization. You planned all of it. The safe, the money, the poison. You wanted me to steal from you. Why would I want such a thing? Because you knew. Somehow, you knew what kind of person I was, and you wanted to teach me a lesson. And what kind of person are you, Chelsea? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was broken and defeated. A thief. A liar. Someone who would steal from the woman who raised the man I married. Is that what you did? Yes. And do you think you deserve to be punished for it? Chelsea looked up at me with eyes full of terrible understanding. Yes, she whispered. I deserved exactly what I got. I sat back down and took her hand again. Chelsea, I want you to understand something very important. What happened to you, the arsenic poisoning, that's a crime. Someone hurt you deliberately, and they need to be held accountable. But I can't report it, she said miserably, because I'd have to admit what I did to get exposed. You could return what you stole, make amends, then report the poisoning to the police. Chelsea shook her head frantically. I can't. Don't you see? If I admit to stealing from you, David will leave me. My whole life will fall apart. Chelsea shook her head frantically. I can't. Don't you see? If I admit to stealing from you, David will leave me. My whole life will fall apart. So, you'd rather suffer in silence than face the consequences of your actions? I don't have a choice. There's always a choice, dear. You could choose to be honest. You could choose to take responsibility for what you've done. And then what? You'd forgive me? David would forgive me? Everything would go back to normal? I smiled at her with genuine warmth. Oh no, sweetheart. Some mistakes can't be undone. Some lessons once learned change you forever. Chelsea stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the exact moment when she fully understood the scope of her situation. She was trapped, poisoned by her own greed, unable to seek justice without destroying herself, forced to carry the knowledge of her crime and its consequences for whatever remained of her life. You're not going to help me, she said quietly. I am helping you, I replied. I'm helping you understand that actions have consequences and that some prices are worth paying to learn important truths about yourself. The money, it's still in my apartment. Still poisoned. Then you should probably dispose of it safely. Arsenic can be dangerous if handled improperly. But if I get rid of it, I'll have no evidence of what you did to me. Evidence of what, dear? All you have is a story about stealing money that was allegedly contaminated with poison. Who would believe such a tale? Chelsea closed her eyes and leaned back against her pillows. You've thought of everything. I've simply allowed natural consequences to unfold. You made choices, Chelsea. Every step of the way, you chose greed over honesty, theft over integrity. What happened to you was the direct result of those choices. But you helped those consequences along. Did I? Or did you simply find exactly what you were looking for? She opened her eyes and stared at me with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. You're not the sweet old lady I thought you were. No, I agreed. I'm not. I'm someone who's lived long enough to recognize predators when they enter my home. I'm someone who's learned that sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to let dangerous people destroy themselves. And if I die from this, then you'll die knowing exactly why. There's a certain honesty in that, don't you think? Chelsea turned her face away from me, staring at the wall with the hollow expression of someone who's just realized they've been completely outmaneuvered. I'm sorry, she whispered,
For what I did to you.
for what I plan to do.
I'm sorry.
I know you are, I said, standing and smoothing my skirt. And that's more than most thieves ever manage to feel. I left the hospital that day with a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt in months. Chelsea understood her situation completely now. She was trapped by her own crimes, slowly dying from her own greed, unable to seek help without destroying what remained of her life. But more importantly, she'd confessed. She'd admitted her guilt, acknowledged her wrongdoing, and accepted that her suffering was deserved. Some lessons, I reflected as I drove home through the autumn countryside, are worth whatever it costs to teach them. David called me at 6 in the morning, his voice tight with panic and confusion. "Mom, something's happened. Chelsea's missing." I sat up in bed, genuinely surprised. "Missing? What do you mean?" "She discharged herself from the hospital last night against medical advice. The doctor said she was in no condition to leave, but she signed the papers and walked out. When I got there this morning to visit her, she was gone." "Have you checked your apartment?" "That's the weird part. She was there. The security cameras show her arriving around midnight. But when I got home this morning, she wasn't there anymore. And Mom, she left something for you." My pulse quickened. "For me?" "A manila envelope with your name on it. She left it on our kitchen table with a note saying to make sure you got it as soon as possible." "What's in it?" "I don't know. I didn't open it. But there's something else." Chelsea cleaned out our safe deposit box, withdrew everything from our joint savings account, even took some jewelry and electronics from the apartment. It's like she was gathering resources for something. Or trying to return what she'd stolen, I thought with grim satisfaction. Chelsea was apparently attempting to make amends before what? Disappearing? Killing herself? Turning herself into the police? "I'll come over right away," I said. "We need to figure out what's going on." David's apartment was in chaos when I arrived. He'd clearly been searching frantically for clues about Chelsea's whereabouts, and the normally pristine space looked like a crime scene. Papers were scattered across the dining table, drawers hung open, and David himself looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Here's the envelope," he said, handing me a thick manila package sealed with tape. She also left this note. The note was written in Chelsea's shaky handwriting. "David, I'm sorry for everything. I can't explain what I've done, but I need to try to make things right before it's too late. Your mother will understand.
Don't try to find me. See."
I opened the envelope carefully, already knowing what I'd find inside. The fake $100 bills were there, still dusted with arsenic powder, wrapped in plastic bags with a note written in the same trembling hand. "Maggie, you were right. I took these from your safe. I know they're poisoned. I know you meant for me to find them. I'm returning them before I hurt anyone else. I'm sorry for what I am."
Chelsea.
But there was more. Underneath the money was my mother's jewelry box, the one I'd noticed missing from my bedroom, along with the silver letter opener and crystal paperweight Chelsea had stolen during her rampage through my house. And at the bottom of the envelope was something I hadn't expected, the manila folder from the safe, containing all those embarrassing photographs of David. "David," I said carefully, "you might want to sit down."
"Why?"
"What's in there?" I showed him the money first, explaining that Chelsea had apparently taken it from my safe and was now returning it. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of sick recognition. "She stole from you," he said quietly. "My wife robbed my mother." "I'm afraid so. But that means the arsenic poisoning. It wasn't random." I nodded gravely. I think Chelsea may have been exposed when she handled whatever she took from the safe. Perhaps there was some kind of old pest control residue on the items she touched. It was a carefully constructed lie that gave David a way to understand the situation without implicating me in deliberate poisoning. Chelsea had stolen contaminated items and been accidentally exposed to arsenic. It was almost believable. "This is insane," David said, running his hands through his hair. "I married a thief, a woman who would steal from my own mother."
"I'm sorry, sweetheart."
"I know this must be devastating. Why didn't you tell me? When you discovered things were missing?" "I wasn't certain," I said carefully, "and I hoped I was wrong about who might have taken them. I didn't want to accuse Chelsea without proof." David was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of his wife's theft and dishonesty. Then he noticed the manila folder. "What's this?" "I'm not sure," I lied. "It was in the envelope with everything else." David opened the folder and immediately turned bright red as he saw the photographs inside. Oh, God. Where did these come from? Your father used to keep some old family photos in the safe, I said diplomatically. I imagine Chelsea found them when she was exploring. These aren't family photos, Mom. These are. He trailed off, too embarrassed to describe what he was seeing. I haven't looked closely, I said, which was technically true. David quickly closed the folder, his face burning with humiliation.
She saw these.
She saw me in. God, this is mortifying. I'm sure she didn't judge you for youthful indiscretions.
You don't understand.
These photos, they're from a very specific period of my life. A period I've never told Chelsea about. A period that would completely change how she sees me. I could practically see the wheels turning in David's mind as he realized the full scope of Chelsea's discovery. She hadn't just stolen money and jewelry. She'd uncovered embarrassing secrets that gave her leverage over him, knowledge she could use to humiliate or manipulate him in the future. Except now she was gone, carrying those secrets with her. David, what exactly is in those photographs that has you so concerned? He looked at me with the expression of a man who just realized his entire marriage had been built on lies and theft. Things that could ruin my reputation, my business, my whole life if they became public. Surely Chelsea wouldn't. Wouldn't what? She's already proven she's willing to steal from family. What makes you think she wouldn't use blackmail if it served her purposes? The paranoia was setting in beautifully. David was now convinced that Chelsea was not only a thief but potentially a blackmailer who disappeared with compromising material about him. The fact that she'd returned the stolen items didn't matter. The damage to his trust was complete and irreversible. We need to find her, he said, pacing around the apartment. We need to get those photos back. David, maybe we should call the police. And tell them what? That my wife stole from my mother and then disappeared with embarrassing photos of me? That she was poisoned by accidentally handling contaminated antiques. They'll think we're all crazy. Then what do you suggest? I don't know. Hire a private investigator? Put out some kind of alert? She can't have gotten far, not in her condition. But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. David was beginning to realize that he didn't really know the woman he'd married at all. If Chelsea was capable of theft and deception on this scale, what else might she be capable of? My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Hello, Mrs. Holloway? This is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Vermont State Police. I'm calling about Chelsea Holloway. We understand she may have had some contact with you recently. My blood ran cold. Yes, she's my daughter-in-law. Is she all right? Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Chelsea Holloway was found deceased this morning at a motel in White River Junction. It appears to be a suicide. The words hit David like a physical blow. He sank into a chair, his face draining of all color. I felt my own knees go weak, though whether from shock or satisfaction, I couldn't be sure. Suicide? I managed to say.
How?
She left a note, ma'am. She also left instructions that certain items be returned to you. We'll need you both to come in and identify the belongings and to answer some questions about Mrs. Holloway's recent behavior. Of course, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. We'll be there as soon as possible. After I hung up, David and I sat in stunned silence. Chelsea was dead. The woman who had invaded my home, stolen from my family, and threatened everything I held dear had taken her own life rather than face the consequences of her actions. She killed herself, David whispered, because of what she did to you, because of the shame. We don't know that for certain, I said gently, though I suspected he was exactly right. The note she left me, she said she needed to make things right before it was too late. She wasn't talking about returning your things. She was talking about ending her life. David broke down then, sobbing with the raw grief of a man who'd just lost everything he thought he'd known about the woman he'd married. I held him while he cried, offering comfort while feeling a cold satisfaction settle deep in my bones. Chelsea had chosen the ultimate escape rather than live with the consequences of her theft. She'd solved all our problems with a single, final act of selfishness. The White River Junction Police Department was a study in small-town efficiency when we arrived that afternoon. Detective Martinez turned out to be a competent woman in her 40s who treated the situation with professional sympathy while clearly harboring suspicions about the circumstances surrounding Chelsea's death. "I want to express my condolences for your loss," she said, leading us into a conference room. "I know this must be very difficult for both of you." David nodded numbly. He'd barely spoken during the drive, alternating between grief and something that looked suspiciously like relief. "Can you tell us what happened?" I asked. "Mrs. Holloway checked into the Riverside Motel around 2 a.m. this morning, paying cash for one night. The desk clerk said she seemed distressed but coherent. Housekeeping found her around noon when she didn't respond to checkout calls." "How did she?" David couldn't finish the question. "Overdose of prescription medications, combined with alcohol. The preliminary examination suggests she consumed a large quantity of pain medication and anti-anxiety drugs, along with a significant amount of vodka." "Medications for what?" I asked. "According to the bottles we found, she'd been prescribed various drugs for arsenic poisoning treatment. The levels in her system were substantial." Detective Martinez opened a file and removed several photographs. "These are the belongings she left with instructions to return to you, Mrs. Holloway." The photos showed a motel room dresser arranged like an altar. My mother's jewelry box sat in the center, surrounded by the silver letter opener, the crystal paperweight, and several small antiques I hadn't even realized were missing. The fake money was there too, still in plastic bags with warning labels Chelsea had apparently written herself. "Contaminated, do not touch." She was very specific about wanting these items returned to their rightful owner, Detective Martinez continued. "She also left this letter for you." She handed me an envelope with my name written in Chelsea's increasingly shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in dense text. "Dear Maggie, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I can't live with what I've become or what I've done to your family. I know you planned this. I know you set a trap for me, and I walked right into it like the greedy fool I am.
You were right about me.
I am exactly the kind of person who would steal from the woman who raised the man I married. I am someone who would put my own desires above loyalty, family, and basic human decency. I don't blame you for what you did to me. I blame myself for being the kind of person who deserved it. The things I took from your house are all there, except for the photos. I destroyed those. David doesn't need to carry the shame of having them in the world, and I don't deserve to keep secrets that could hurt him. I hope someday you can forgive me, not for your sake, but for mine. I need to believe that somewhere someone understands that I knew I was wrong and that I tried to make it right before the end. Tell David I'm sorry. I wasn't the woman he thought he married. Tell him he deserves better than what I gave him. Chelsea *. I read the letter aloud to David and Detective Martinez, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. Chelsea's final confession was everything I could have hoped for, an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement that her punishment was deserved, and most importantly, exoneration for me in her own words. She mentions that someone planned this and set a trap, Detective Martinez observed. Do either of you have any idea what she might have meant by that? I think the arsenic poisoning affected her thinking, David said quietly. She'd become very paranoid in recent weeks, convinced that someone was deliberately trying to hurt her. She actually accused me of poisoning her, I added with carefully manufactured sadness. The doctors said that kind of paranoid thinking was common with arsenic exposure, especially when the brain is affected. Detective Martinez made notes. And you have no idea how she might have been exposed to arsenic. The only thing I can think of is the antiques she apparently took from my house, I said. Some of those pieces are very old, from an era when arsenic-based treatments were used for pest control and wood preservation. If she handled them extensively without gloves. That's possible, the detective agreed. We'll need to test the items she returned to determine if they're contaminated. Of course, I said. I want to know if there's any danger to other people. Mrs. Holloway, I have to ask, did you know that Chelsea had taken these items from your home? I suspected something was missing, I said carefully, but I wasn't certain what or when. I didn't want to make accusations without proof, especially against my son's wife. And you didn't report the theft? I was still hoping I was wrong about who might have taken them. Detective Martinez turned to David. Did your wife ever mention taking anything from your mother's house? Never, David said firmly. If I'd known she was stealing from my own mother. He trailed off, shaking his head. She mentions destroying some photographs. Do you know what she's referring to? David's face flushed red. Personal items. Nothing relevant to what happened to her. I see. Detective Martinez made more notes. Is there anything else either of you can tell me about Chelsea's state of mind or behavior in the weeks before her death? She'd become increasingly paranoid and secretive, David said. She was convinced someone was trying to hurt her, but she wouldn't tell me who or why. She'd also become very possessive about our finances, wanting to know exactly how much money we had and where it was kept. She asked me a lot of questions about my antiques and valuables, I added. I thought she was just interested in family history, but looking back, it seems like she might have been evaluating things. For theft purposes? I'm afraid so. The interview continued for another hour, with Detective Martinez methodically documenting the timeline of Chelsea's illness, her suspicious behavior, and the circumstances of her death. By the time we left the station, I was confident that the official record would show exactly what I wanted it to show. Chelsea Holloway had been a thief who'd accidentally poisoned herself while stealing antiques, then killed herself rather than face the consequences of her crimes. David and I drove home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled into my driveway, he finally spoke. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my voice calm. Of course, sweetheart. Did you suspect what Chelsea was planning? Did you know she was going to steal from you? I considered my words carefully. I knew she was very interested in my belongings. I knew she was asking pointed questions about values and security. I suspected she might try something, yes. But you didn't do anything to stop her? What would you have me do? Accuse your wife of planning to rob me based on suspicious questions and lingering looks? You would have thought I was a paranoid old woman. David was quiet for a moment. If you suspected she might steal from you, why didn't you take precautions? Move valuables to a safe deposit box, or... I did take precautions, I said carefully. I made sure that anything truly valuable was properly secured. The items Chelsea took were replaceable, but the arsenic exposure was an accident. Those old pieces genuinely could have been contaminated. I had no way of knowing the pest control methods used decades ago when they were manufactured. David studied my face for a long moment, and I could see him weighing what he knew against what he suspected. Finally, he sighed. I keep thinking I should feel worse about losing her, he said quietly. But mostly I feel relieved. Is that terrible? You feel relieved because you've learned something important about the woman you married, I said gently. You've learned that she was capable of betraying your trust in the most fundamental way possible. It's natural to feel relieved that you no longer have to live with that uncertainty. She could have destroyed my life with those photographs. But she chose not to. In the end, Chelsea did try to make amends. By killing herself. by accepting responsibility for her actions and ensuring they couldn't hurt anyone else. David was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at me with eyes that held new understanding. "You're not the sweet, helpless old lady everyone thinks you are you?" I smiled at him with genuine warmth. "I'm your mother, David. I'm someone who loves you enough to protect you from people who would hurt you, even when those people share your bed. And if that protection requires extreme measures?" Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is allow natural consequences to unfold without interference. David nodded slowly, and I could see him processing the implications of what I'd said without saying. He understood, on some level, that I'd played a more active role in Chelsea's downfall than I was admitting. But he also understood that whatever I'd done it to protect him and our family. "I love you, Mom," he said finally. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." That evening, alone in my house for the first time in months, without the specter of Chelsea's greed hanging over everything, I opened a bottle of Henry's best wine and toasted my late husband's photograph. "Justice served, darling," I said to his smiling face. "The thief learned her lesson. Our son is safe, and our family treasures remain where they belong." Chelsea's suicide had been the perfect conclusion to her crime. She'd punished herself more thoroughly than any court could have, removing herself from David's life while simultaneously confessing her guilt and exonerating me of any wrongdoing. Some problems, I reflected as I sipped my wine, solve themselves if you're patient enough to let them. The funeral was a sparse affair held in a generic chapel across town, attended by perhaps 20 people who seemed more curious than grieved. Chelsea's family had flown in from Ohio, a defeated-looking mother and father who clearly didn't understand how their daughter had ended up dead in Vermont, married to a man they'd met only once. I sat in the back with David, who'd insisted on attending despite his complicated feelings about his late wife. He'd said it was the right thing to do, that Chelsea deserved at least one person mourning her who'd actually loved her, even if that love had been built on lies. The service was conducted by a chaplain who'd clearly never met Chelsea, reading generic passages about redemption and forgiveness, while the small congregation shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke about who Chelsea really was, the ambitious young woman who'd seen a wealthy older man as her ticket to security, the thief who'd targeted her own family, the troubled soul who'd chosen death over accountability. "She was taken from us too soon," the chaplain intoned, "but we can find comfort in knowing that she's found peace at last." David's hand tightened on mine during that part. We both knew that Chelsea's peace had come at a terrible price, one she'd paid herself rather than face the consequences of her actions. After the service, Chelsea's parents approached us hesitantly. David, Chelsea's mother, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair, looked at my son with desperate hope. "We're trying to understand what happened. Chelsea's last phone call, she sounded so strange. Talking about making mistakes and learning lessons. Do you know what she meant?" David glanced at me, then back at Chelsea's mother. She'd been struggling with some personal issues.
Depression, anxiety.
The doctors think the arsenic poisoning may have affected her judgment. But how was she exposed to arsenic? The police couldn't give us a clear answer. "We believe it was accidental," I said gently. "Some old antiques in my home may have been treated with arsenic-based preservatives decades ago. Chelsea handled them without proper protection." "But why was she handling your antiques?" Chelsea's father asked, his tone suggesting he suspected there was more to the story. "She was interested in family history," I said smoothly. "She wanted to learn about the pieces David would inherit someday." It wasn't technically a lie, though it omitted the crucial detail that Chelsea's interest had been financial rather than sentimental. "She seemed so happy when she married David," her mother said mournfully. "She talked about finally having the life she'd always wanted." "I'm sure she did," I replied with genuine sympathy. Chelsea had indeed gotten the life she'd wanted, at least until her greed destroyed it. We exchanged contact information and promises to stay in touch, though I suspected Chelsea's parents would prefer to forget this entire chapter of their daughter's life. They'd lost a child to circumstances they couldn't understand or control, and dwelling on the details would only deepen their pain. After they left, David and I stood in the parking lot of the funeral home, watching the other mourners disperse into the gray October afternoon. "That's it then," David said quietly. "Chelsea's story is over." "Yes," I agreed. "It is. And our story continues."
Yes.
"It does." We drove home in contemplative silence, both of us processing the finality of what had just occurred. Chelsea was buried, her crimes were buried with her, and David was free to rebuild his life without the weight of her deception. Over the following weeks, David threw himself into work with the focused intensity of someone trying to outrun grief and guilt. His architectural firm had several major projects in development, and he used them as anchors to keep himself grounded while processing everything he'd learned about his late wife. I helped where I could, bringing him meals when he forgot to eat, and listening when he needed to talk through his feelings about the marriage he'd lost and the woman he'd never really known. "I keep thinking about the signs I missed," he said one evening as we sat in my kitchen sharing a pot of tea. "The way she was always asking about money, about valuables, about what I'd inherit someday. I thought she was just interested in security, in planning for our future together." "She was interested in security," I said. "Just not the kind you thought." "I feel like such a fool." "You fell in love with the woman Chelsea pretended to be. That's not foolish, that's human. But how did I not see what she really was? How did you see it when I couldn't?" I sipped my tea thoughtfully before answering. "I've had more practice dealing with people who want things they haven't earned. 30 years of teaching gives you a very clear perspective on human nature." "You never liked her." "I didn't trust her," I corrected. "There's a difference. I wanted to like her, for your sake. But something about her felt calculated." "The whole relationship was calculated," David said bitterly. "She targeted me at that conference, didn't she? Researched my background, learned about my family's financial situation, and decided I was worth pursuing." "Probably," I agreed. "But that doesn't mean her feelings for you weren't real on some level. People are complicated, David. Chelsea could have genuinely loved you while also seeing you as an opportunity. Does that make it better or worse?" "It makes it more understandable. And maybe, eventually, it will make it easier to forgive her." David was quiet for a moment. "Do you forgive her?" "I forgive her for being weak," I said carefully. "I forgive her for making choices based on fear and greed rather than love and integrity. I don't forgive her for targeting our family or for betraying your trust." "But you're not glad she's dead?" The question caught me off guard because the honest answer was complicated. I wasn't glad Chelsea was dead. I'd wanted her to learn from her mistakes and change her behavior, not die from them. But I also couldn't deny that her death had solved problems that might have been unsolvable otherwise. "I'm sad that she felt death was her only option," I said finally. "I'm sad that she couldn't find the courage to face the consequences of her actions and try to build a better life. But I'm not sorry that you're free from a relationship built on deception." "That's probably the most honest answer I'm going to get," David said with a rueful smile. "It's the most honest answer I can give." 3 months after Chelsea's funeral, David started dating again. Nothing serious, just dinner dates with women he met through work or mutual friends. He was taking things slowly, building trust carefully, and most importantly, he was asking me for my opinion about the women he brought around. "I know you're being polite," he said after introducing me to Sarah, a landscape architect who seemed genuinely pleasant and appropriately interested in David rather than his assets. "But I really want to know what you think." "I think she's lovely," I said honestly. "She seems genuine, accomplished, and she looks at you like you matter to her as a person, not as a provider."
Good.
Because I really like her, and I need to know my judgment is improving. Your judgment was never bad, sweetheart. You just got targeted by someone who is very good at deception. Promise me something, Mom. What? If you ever get bad feelings about someone I'm seeing, tell me immediately. Don't be polite or diplomatic. Just tell me. I promise, I said, meaning it completely. David's request made me realize how fundamentally our relationship had changed since Chelsea's death. He now saw me not just as his loving mother, but as someone with keen instincts about people and their motivations. He trusted my judgment in ways he never had before, and he understood that sometimes protecting the people you love requires difficult decisions. That evening, after David and Sarah had left for their date, I sat in my living room surrounded by the antiques and treasures that had started this whole situation. Every piece was back in its proper place, cleaned and catalogued and secured against future threats. My mother's jewelry box sat on the mantelpiece, containing the few pieces of real jewelry I actually owned. The silver letter opener was back in the desk drawer where it belonged. The crystal paperweight caught the lamplight from its position on the bookshelf. But more than the physical objects, what had been restored was the sense of safety and security in my own home. For months, I'd felt like I was living under siege, knowing that someone was calculating the value of everything around me and planning to take what they wanted. Now that threat was gone, permanently removed by the very greed that had created it. Henry's safe sat empty in his study, its door standing open like a mouth that had finished speaking. I disposed of the arsenic-tainted fake money through a hazardous waste facility, claiming I discovered old pest control materials in my attic. The spring mechanism had been removed and discarded. The embarrassing photographs of David had been burned in my fireplace, their ashes scattered in my garden. There was no evidence left of the trap I'd set, no proof of the careful planning that had led to Chelsea's downfall. All that remained was the official record. A troubled young woman had accidentally poisoned herself while stealing antiques, then killed herself rather than face the consequences of her crimes. Justice, I reflected, didn't always wear a blindfold and carry scales. Sometimes it wore a grandmother's smile and carried a cup of tea. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility that I hadn't felt since Henry's death. My garden, dormant through the long Vermont winter, burst into life with an enthusiasm that seemed to mirror my own emerging sense of freedom and security. I was kneeling among the daffodils, preparing the soil for this year's vegetable garden, when David's car pulled into my driveway. He'd been visiting more regularly since Chelsea's death, sometimes alone and sometimes with Sarah, who was becoming a fixture in his life and, I was pleased to note, in mine as well. "Mom," he called out, emerging from the car with a broad smile and a small velvet box in his hand. "I have news." I stood up, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves, and felt my heart leap with joy at the obvious implications of that little box. "David, you didn't." "I did," he said, his face glowing with happiness. "I asked Sarah to marry me last night, and she said yes." I pulled off my gloves and threw my arms around my son, genuinely delighted by this development. Sarah was everything Chelsea hadn't been: honest, accomplished, self-sufficient, and clearly devoted to David for all the right reasons. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so happy for you both. When's the wedding?" "We're thinking fall, maybe October. Nothing elaborate. We both want something simple and meaningful rather than flashy." The contrast to Chelsea's wedding demands was stark and telling. Sarah didn't need a 3-dress extravaganza to feel special. She just needed David and the promise of a genuine partnership. "I can't wait to help with the planning," I said. "Sarah has such lovely taste. I'm sure it will be beautiful." "Actually, Mom, there's something else I wanted to talk to you about." David's expression became more serious. "Sarah and I have been discussing the future, and we both feel strongly about something." "What's that?" "We want you to consider moving in with us. Or rather, We want to move in here with you. I blinked in surprise. Here? In this house? This place is huge, and you're all alone in it. Sarah and I are cramped in my apartment, and we'd love to have more space. But more than that, we want to be close to you. We want any children we might have to grow up knowing their grandmother, learning from her, spending time with her. The offer was so unexpected and so generous that I felt tears spring to my eyes. After Chelsea's invasion of my home and privacy, I'd begun to think of this house as a fortress that needed to be defended rather than a home that could be shared. Are you certain? This is a big step, and you haven't been together very long. We've talked about it extensively, David assured me. Sarah loves this house, loves the history and character of it. She's an architect too, so she understands good design when she sees it. And honestly, Mom, after what happened with Chelsea, we both feel like family should stick together. I considered the proposal carefully. The house was indeed too large for one person, and the prospect of sharing it with David and Sarah, two people I genuinely liked and trusted, was enormously appealing. What would the living arrangements be?
I asked.
We'd convert the entire second floor into our private space, bedroom, sitting room, home office for both of us. You have the entire first floor to yourself, plus your choice of guest rooms when people visit. We'd share the kitchen and dining room, the living room, and all the common areas. And you're both comfortable with this arrangement? Sarah actually suggested it, David said with a smile. She said she'd love to learn about the family antiques from someone who knows their history, and she wants to make sure you never feel isolated or vulnerable again. The reference to feeling vulnerable was pointed, and I knew David was thinking about Chelsea's predatory behavior and the risks that came with living alone with valuable possessions. I'd love to have you both here, I said finally, but only if you're certain this is what you want, not what you think you should do. Mom, this house has been in our family for over 40 years. It should continue to be our family home, with multiple generations living here and sharing the responsibility of maintaining it. That afternoon, Sarah came by to discuss the practical details of the arrangement. She was even more enthusiastic about the plan than David, bubbling with ideas about how to modernize certain aspects of the house while preserving its historical character. I hope you don't mind, she said as we toured the second floor together, but I've been researching some of your antique pieces online. The craftsmanship is incredible, and the historical significance is amazing. You have museum-quality pieces here. I'm glad you appreciate them, I said, noting how different Sarah's interest was from Chelsea's calculating appraisals. Sarah saw beauty and history, where Chelsea had seen dollar signs. David mentioned that his ex-wife was also interested in the antiques, Sarah said carefully. I hope you don't think I'm being inappropriate by asking about them. Not at all. Chelsea's interest was different from yours. David said she had some kind of accident involving old pest control chemicals. I nodded, giving Sarah the same explanation I'd given everyone else. Some of the older pieces may have been treated with substances that are now known to be dangerous. It's a reminder that we need to be careful when handling antiques, especially ones with unknown provenance. That's terrible. She must have been devastated to realize she'd been poisoned by something she was just trying to appreciate. If only she knew, I thought. But Sarah's sympathy for Chelsea was genuine, and it spoke well of her character that she could feel compassion for a woman she'd never met. Over the summer, David and Sarah gradually moved their belongings into the house while contractors updated the electrical and plumbing systems on the second floor. The renovation was extensive but respectful, preserving the historical integrity of the house while creating comfortable, modern living spaces. I found myself genuinely enjoying the company and the gentle bustle of activity that came with sharing the house. Sarah was an ideal roommate, neat, considerate, and genuinely interested in learning about the family history and traditions. David was happier than I'd seen him in years, freed from the stress and uncertainty that had characterized his relationship with Chelsea. You know, Sarah said one evening as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset, David told me about some of the difficulties you had with Chelsea. I hope you know that I would never, that is, I hope you feel comfortable with me being here. I'm very comfortable, I assured her. You're nothing like Chelsea. How so? I considered how much to reveal. Chelsea saw this house and everything in it as potential assets. She was always calculating values, always thinking about what things were worth rather than what they meant. You see the beauty and history first. David said she even took some things without permission.
She did.
It was very hurtful, not because of the monetary value, but because it felt like such a violation of trust. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I can't imagine doing something like that to family. To anyone, really, but especially to someone who'd welcomed me into their home. Some people have different values, I said diplomatically. I suppose. But it seems like such a fundamental difference in character. How do you even begin to understand someone who would steal from their own family? It was a good question, and one I'd pondered extensively over the past year. I think some people see the world as a place where you take what you can get before someone else takes it from you. They don't understand concepts like loyalty or gratitude because they've never experienced them genuinely. That's sad. It is. But it's also dangerous, because people like that will exploit anyone who extends trust or kindness to them. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. David said, you were the one who figured out what Chelsea was doing. That you suspected her long before he did. Experience teaches you to recognize certain patterns, I said carefully. What kind of patterns? Questions that seem innocent but aren't. Interest that feels calculated rather than genuine. The way someone's eyes move when they're evaluating rather than appreciating. You must have been a formidable teacher. I smiled at the compliment. I had 30 years of practice dealing with teenagers who thought they were smarter than they actually were. It develops certain instincts. And those instincts told you Chelsea was trouble? Those instincts told me Chelsea was someone who wanted things she hadn't earned and would be willing to take shortcuts to get them. But David loved her. David loved the woman Chelsea pretended to be. That's not his fault. It's hers, for being deliberately deceptive. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd told her. Finally, she looked at me with new understanding. You protected him, she said softly. When you realized what Chelsea was, you found a way to protect David from her. I protected our family, I said simply. By letting her reveal her true nature? By creating circumstances where her choices would have natural consequences. Sarah studied my face, and I could see her working through the implications of what I'd said without saying. She was intelligent enough to read between the lines, to understand that Chelsea's downfall hadn't been entirely accidental. I'm glad David has you watching out for him, she said finally. And I hope you know that you'll never need to watch out for him with me. I love him, and I love this family, and I would never do anything to hurt either of you. I know, I said, and I meant it. Sarah's character was evident in everything she did and said. She was exactly the kind of woman I'd hoped David would find, someone worthy of his love and trust. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the gentle sounds of David and Sarah moving around upstairs, I felt a profound sense of contentment. My family was safe, my home was secure, and the future looked brighter than it had in years. Chelsea's greed had ultimately been her own destruction, removing her from our lives while teaching David valuable lessons about trust and judgment. The pain of her betrayal had made him more careful, more thoughtful, more appreciative of genuine love when he found it. 2 years after Chelsea's death, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and secure. David and Sarah's wedding had been everything Chelsea's had not been: intimate, meaningful, and focused on the commitment they were making rather than the spectacle they were creating. They'd honeymooned in Ireland, exploring castles and learning about architecture and history, returning with stories and photographs that brought joy rather than jealousy. Sarah was pregnant now, due in the spring, and the prospect of a grandchild had filled the house with a sense of anticipation and hope that made every room feel brighter. We'd spent months preparing a nursery in one of the guest rooms, carefully choosing furnishings that would blend with the house's historical character while providing all the modern conveniences a baby would need. I was arranging flowers in the front hall one October morning when the doorbell rang. Through the side lights, I could see a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, professionally dressed, with a kind of purposeful bearing that suggested official business. "Mrs. Holloway?" she said when I opened the door. "My name is Detective Jennifer Walsh, Vermont State Police. I was hoping I could speak with you about Chelsea Holloway." My blood chilled, but I kept my expression politely curious. "Of course. Please come in. Is there some new development in her case?" "Not exactly new," Detective Walsh said, accepting my invitation and following me into the living room. "But there are some aspects of her death that have continued to trouble me, and I was hoping you might be able to help clarify a few things." "I'll certainly try," I said, settling into my armchair and gesturing for her to take the sofa. "Though I'm not sure what I could add to what I told Detective Martinez 2 years ago." "I've read Detective Martinez's report thoroughly," Walsh said, opening a file folder. "And I've reviewed all the evidence from the original investigation. What brings me here today is some new information that's come to light." "What kind of information?" "We've been investigating a series of antique thefts in the region, and during that investigation, we discovered that Chelsea had been in contact with several known fences and black market dealers in the months before her death." I felt my heart rate accelerate, but I kept my voice steady. Fences. People who specialize in selling stolen goods, particularly high-value antiques and jewelry. Chelsea had been asking very specific questions about how to authenticate pieces, how to determine values, and how to find buyers for items that might have questionable provenance. "You think she was planning to steal antiques?" "I think she'd already been stealing antiques, Mrs. Holloway. The question is from whom?" Detective Walsh opened her folder and removed several photographs. "These are items that were recovered from known fences over the past 6 months. Items that match descriptions of pieces reported stolen from homes in this area." She laid the photos on my coffee table, and I studied them with carefully manufactured confusion. There were silver pieces, jewelry, small decorative objects, the kind of easily portable valuables that a professional thief would target. "I don't recognize any of these," I said honestly. "I didn't expect you would. But here's what's interesting." Several of the fences mentioned that Chelsea had shown them photographs of specific pieces she claimed to have access to. Pieces she described as belonging to her husband's family. The implication was clear, but I maintained my expression of concerned confusion. "You think she was planning to steal from us?" "I think she was already stealing from you, Mrs. Holloway. The items she returned before her death, your jewelry box, the silver pieces, the crystal paperweight, those weren't the only things she'd taken, were they?" I considered my options carefully. Detective Walsh was clearly more thorough than her predecessor, and she'd done significant investigative work that Martinez had either missed or ignored. Lying outright would be dangerous if she had evidence I wasn't aware of. "I suspected some items were missing," I said slowly. "Small things, pieces I might not notice immediately, but I could never be certain when they disappeared or who might have taken them." "Why didn't you report these suspicions?" "Because Chelsea was my daughter-in-law, and I didn't want to destroy David's marriage over what might have been my own absent-mindedness. I'm 69 years old, Detective. Sometimes I misplace things. But you did take precautions?" The question was loaded, and I could see that Detective Walsh suspected I'd done more than simply notice items going missing. "What kind of precautions?" "Security measures. Changes to your routines. Perhaps ensuring that anything truly valuable was properly secured." I made sure my most important pieces were in safe locations, yes. Including the items in your husband's safe? My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice level. The safe contained family documents and a few sentimental pieces. Nothing of significant monetary value. But Chelsea thought there was something valuable in there, didn't she? The fences said she mentioned having access to a safe containing cash and jewelry. Then she was mistaken about its contents. Detective Walsh studied my face for a long moment. Mrs. Holloway, I'm going to be direct with you. I believe Chelsea Holloway was systematically stealing from your home over a period of several months. I believe she was planning to rob your safe as part of a larger theft operation. And I believe her death was connected to that attempted theft. In what way? The arsenic poisoning. The levels in her system were extremely high, higher than what you'd expect from casual contact with contaminated antiques. It suggests prolonged or concentrated exposure. I don't understand what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Holloway. I'm stating my professional opinion that Chelsea was deliberately exposed to a lethal dose of arsenic, and that exposure was connected to her criminal activities. The accusation hung in the air between us, clear and unmistakable. Detective Walsh believed I had deliberately poisoned Chelsea, and she was here to get me to confess. Detective Walsh, I said carefully, are you suggesting that I murdered my son's wife? I'm suggesting that a known thief died under suspicious circumstances after attempting to steal from someone who had both the means and the motive to stop her. And what means would those be? Access to arsenic compounds, knowledge of her plans, the ability to contaminate items you knew she would steal. I stood up and walked to the window, buying myself time to think. Detective Walsh had clearly done her homework, but she was still working with theories rather than evidence. The key was to acknowledge what she could prove while deflecting what she couldn't. Detective, I said, turning back to face her, let me tell you what I think happened to Chelsea. I think she was a troubled young woman who married my son for financial security rather than love. I think she became obsessed with the idea that this house contained hidden wealth, and she began stealing items to test whether I would notice or report the thefts. Go on. I think she convinced herself that my husband's safe contained something valuable, and she planned to rob it during one of my absences. I think she somehow gained access to the safe, discovered that its contents weren't what she'd expected, and realized that her crimes would inevitably be discovered. And the arsenic? I think she was exposed to contaminated materials during her thefts. Some of the pieces in this house are very old, and the preservation methods used decades ago weren't always safe by modern standards. You're suggesting the poisoning was accidental? I'm suggesting that Chelsea's greed led her to handle things she shouldn't have handled without taking proper precautions. The arsenic exposure was a consequence of her criminal activities, not a deliberate attack. Detective Walsh made notes while I spoke, her expression skeptical, but not dismissive. And the suicide? I think Chelsea realized that her theft would be discovered, that her marriage would be destroyed, and that she might face criminal charges. I think she chose death over accountability. That's a very neat explanation, Mrs. Holloway. It's the truth, Detective. Or it's a very carefully constructed story designed to cover up a murder. The word hung between us like a challenge. Detective Walsh was pushing hard, trying to provoke a reaction that would give her something concrete to work with. Detective Walsh, I said, returning to my chair and looking her directly in the eyes, if you believe I committed a crime, then you should arrest me. If you don't have evidence to support that belief, then perhaps you should focus your investigative efforts on cases where you do. It was a calculated risk, calling her bluff, but I was confident that she didn't have the evidence needed to support charges. Everything she'd presented was circumstantial and theoretical. I'm not ready to make an arrest, she admitted. But this investigation isn't closed, Mrs. Holloway. If new evidence emerges, then I'm sure you'll pursue it appropriately, I interrupted. In the meantime, I prefer not to have these allegations hanging over my family. My son and daughter-in-law are expecting their first child, and they don't need the stress of unfounded accusations about events that happened 2 years ago. Detective Walsh closed her folder and stood to leave. Mrs. Holloway, if Chelsea was stealing from you, if she violated your trust and threatened your security, I can understand why you might have wanted to protect yourself. Of course. But if you took matters into your own hands, if you decided to punish her yourself rather than let the legal system handle it, that would be murder, regardless of what she did to deserve it. I understand the legal definitions, Detective. I hope you do, because if I can prove that you deliberately poisoned Chelsea Holloway, I will arrest you and prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. I would expect nothing less, I said, walking her to the door. Good day, Detective. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing what had just occurred. Detective Walsh was clearly suspicious, but she was also clearly frustrated by her inability to prove anything. The investigation had been reopened, but without new physical evidence, it would likely remain a collection of theories and circumstantial connections. More importantly, Walsh's visit had confirmed that my precautions had been successful. The official record still showed Chelsea as a thief who died from accidental poisoning and subsequent suicide. No evidence existed to contradict that narrative, and no witnesses could testify to anything that would implicate me in deliberate murder. When David and Sarah came home that evening, I told them about Detective Walsh's visit, framing it as a routine follow-up investigation into Chelsea's criminal activities. She thinks Chelsea was part of a larger theft ring? Sarah asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her pregnant belly. Apparently so. The detective said they'd found evidence that Chelsea was in contact with people who buy stolen antiques. That's horrible, David said. I knew she'd taken things from you, Mom, but I didn't realize it was part of a bigger operation. It explains why she was so knowledgeable about values and authentication, I said. She wasn't just randomly stealing, she was targeting specific pieces for resale. Do you think there will be more investigations? Sarah asked. I doubt it. The detective seemed frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence. Chelsea's death closed off most of the leads they might have pursued. Good, David said firmly. I don't want you dealing with this anymore, Mom. Chelsea made her choices, and she paid for them. The rest of us need to move on. That night, alone in my bedroom, I allowed myself a moment of honest reflection about Detective Walsh's accusations. She was right, of course. I had deliberately poisoned Chelsea, knowing it would likely kill her. I had planned and executed what could legally be called murder, but I felt no guilt about it. Chelsea had invaded my home, violated my trust, and threatened my family's security. She had proven herself to be a predator who would continue stealing and manipulating until someone stopped her. I had stopped her. Permanently. Effectively. And in a way that ensured she would understand exactly why she was being punished. Some crimes, I believed, deserved more than imprisonment. They deserved the kind of justice that could only be delivered by someone who understood the full scope of the damage that had been done. 3 months later, Detective Walsh called to inform me that the investigation into Chelsea's death had been officially closed due to lack of evidence. The case would remain in the files as an accidental poisoning and suicide, and no further investigative resources would be allocated to it. I thanked her for her diligence and hung up the phone with a sense of profound closure. 2 weeks after that call, my granddaughter was born, a beautiful, healthy baby girl that David and Sarah named Margaret after me. As I held her for the first time, feeling the weight of new life and new possibilities in my arms, I thought about the legacy I would leave her. She would grow up in a house filled with love and genuine family treasures. She would learn about history and beauty and the importance of protecting what matters most. She would understand that sometimes standing up for what's right requires courage and difficult choices. And she would never know that her grandmother had once been willing to commit murder to protect the family she loved. Some stories, I reflected as I rocked my granddaughter to sleep, are meant to end with justice served and lessons learned. Some villains write their own punishments through the choices they make. And sometimes, when the legal system fails to protect the innocent, ordinary people must find extraordinary ways to ensure that evil does not triumph. Chelsea had opened a safe she should never have touched, seeking treasures that were never meant for her. What she found instead was a lesson about consequences, a lesson that cost her everything she'd tried so hard to steal. In the end, she got exactly what she deserved. And my family got exactly what we needed: peace, security, and the knowledge that we were protected by someone who would never let predators destroy what we'd built together. The safe in Henry's study remained empty now, its door standing open like a mouth that had finished speaking its final word. But the real treasure, the safety and love of family, was more secure than ever. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But some lessons, once learned, protect generations to come. If Margaret's story of perfect justice moved you, if her calculated protection of family gave you chills, then you belong here with us. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because every week we bring you stories of people who refused to be victims, who turned their wisdom into weapons, and who proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. What's your story of standing up to someone who thought you were weak? Share it in the comments below. We read every single one.